Good morning, good afternoon, good evening, everybody, wherever you may be in the world joining this exciting Congress. My name is Thomas Cherry-Kowanga, and I'm an associate professor at Westlake University in China, where my group is working on agroecology and the global food system transformation. I'm very happy to be the moderator of this morning session here for you. It's my pleasure to welcome you online, and especially our speakers and panelists to this first roundtable of the Scientific Symposium on Transformational Change in the Food Production System and Nature Positive Solution. So this roundtable will identify ways to facilitate progressive transformational change in food production systems by boosting nature positive production. We have heard multiple times during this exciting Congress, but also during the climate and biodiversity summits, that agriculture production is an urgent need to transformation away from systems that emit 1/3 of all greenhouse gas emissions and are largely responsible for driving 1 million species on the brink to extinction. We cannot afford to use 2/3 of the global land area under production just for livestock to produce only a fraction of the world calories and proteins consumed. Agrobiodiversity is at the core of the solution and of the integrated approach that simultaneously applies ecological and social principles to the design and management of fair and sustainable agricultural systems. In a nutshell, this is basically what we call agroecology, which has been promoted from grassroots organizations all the way to the United Nations Food and Agricultural Organization and applies to all agricultural systems on land and on oceans. An important agroecological principle is enhancing agrobiodiversity of agricultural systems. Recent research here has shown that diversification can increase biodiversity, but also crop yields and ecosystem services like soil fertility, climate resilience, biological pest control, and pollination. We also know that smaller instead of larger fields provide us with higher yields and more biodiverse systems, and biodiversity here being the precursor of ecosystem services. And lastly, local crop varieties can provide alternative protein sources compared to livestock production that also drives climate change. However, most of these findings are context dependent on crops and also on the regions. So a couple of important questions emerge from these developments. Basically, given that our agricultural production is largely based on intensified systems, how do we know, and we know how to make them sustainable, what is a likely future for agricultural production based on agrobiodiversity? And what are the most important advances in this research? Moreover, what role does technology play and which technologies? We have different technologies ranging from genome editing for agricultural crops, but also agricultural monitoring for more data-driven agricultural decision-making. The effects may be vastly different. And what are the future research directions that are important? For instance, we know much less about the temporal aspects of diversification and how sustainably use aquatic biodiversity to provide proteins from the ocean. So in the next 30 minutes, we will hear 6 exciting talks from different parts of the world. And after these presentations, we go into a 15-minute Q&A session and start 45 minutes panel discussion, where we'll discuss future of agriculture, the role of technology in the transition process, and the research needs and barriers for implementation. So just a note for the audience here, to engage with the speakers and later our panelists, please leave your questions for the speakers in the question panel in the Whova app. And please make sure that you clearly also mark the names of the speakers, and I will do my best to pass them on to the speakers and answer them in time. So now it's my great pleasure to introduce the first 3 exciting speakers. The first is Stefan Arquette, a senior research analyst at the Millennium Institute at the US, and he will be talking about applications of beneficial microbial consortia as plant probiotics for sustainable agriculture. The second talk will be given by Andrea Sanchez, a research assistant in the multifunctional landscapes team with the Alliance. And she will be talking about financial profitability of diversified farming systems based on a global meta-analysis. And the third talk in this first block will be given by Camilla Figueiredo, a researcher at Fevale University, and she will be talking about agroecology strategies to promote conservation with insights from Brazilian small farmers. Very much looking forward to the session and see you again soon.
My name is Steve Arquette. I'm a policy modeler with the Millennium Institute. First, I want to thank the Secretariat of the Second International Agrobiodiversity Congress for the opportunity to share some of our research with you. Also, I would like to introduce the co-authors, Derek Chan and Emil Zaharia Kezdi of the Millennium Institute, and John Ulloa and Charlotte Pavago of BioVision Zurich. The research is about balancing organic food production with food self-sufficiency through agroecology, a sustainable approach to farming closely aligned to agrobiodiversity. Our research question is, can agriculture in Bhutan be made 100% organic while also improving food self-sufficiency? A bit of background. The royal government of Bhutan has a goal to become the first entirely organic nation in agricultural production. However, Bhutan also wants to improve food self-sufficiency, particularly in rice, for which it is only about 47% self-sufficient. Researchers have questioned whether this is possible, given that current organic yields are generally lower than for conventional agriculture. Our purpose is to identify policies through which Bhutan might accomplish both goals. The research is part of a much larger project called the Food Policy Forum for Change, which is a peer-to-peer exchange of policymakers for upscaling agroecology. To date, more than 80 countries are members of this exchange. The forum is managed by BioVision Zurich in partnership with IFOAM International and the Millennium Institute. The FAO is providing technical support, and the forum is funded by the German Federal Ministry for Economic Cooperation and Development through GIZ, and by the Swiss Agency for Development and Cooperation. Our objectives are to build an integrated systems model that includes essential components and decision-making processes that can drive change in agriculture. The simplified schematic to the right shows key sectors in the model. The model gives us the opportunity to simulate and test policies for upscaling organic agriculture and improving food self-sufficiency, in this case, for rice in Bhutan. We look at two policies. First, training farmers in organic agroecological methods that can improve yields and sustainability over time. And second, a policy combining training with a fee-bait program. Now, what exactly do we mean by fee-bait? In this case, the fee-bait takes the form of a fee or tax on chemical farming inputs. The proceeds are pooled and distributed to certified agroecological farmers. By nesting this model in our integrated SDG model, we will also estimate the impacts of fully organic agriculture on the SDGs in Bhutan. On the left side of this slide, you see two simulations. The top one with the training policy, the lower one with the fee-bait plus training. As you can see, the patterns are similar. However, the simulation with fee-bait shows a faster transition to agroecology. And at year 2040, agroecology is almost 100% of the total rice area. Rice self-sufficiency improves in both scenarios. However, not to the 60% target set by the Bhutanese government. On the right are sensitivity simulations to assess the robustness of the policies to uncertain production cost parameters. The pink color indicates where 95% of 250 simulations fall when these parameters are randomly varied. A comparison of the confidence intervals shows that the fee-bait plus training policy is the more robust policy. Research contributions to the Congress, we propose that the fee-bait approach warrants consideration as a policy to move agriculture toward agroecology or agrobiodiversity. Another contribution is the model itself. With a little modification, the model could be set up to investigate policies for agricultural change in other countries or states. More generally, we hope we have demonstrated the value of systems modeling and simulation for designing and testing policies for agricultural change. Thank you. I look forward to our discussions.
Hi, my name is Andrea Sanchez. I'm from Paraguay, and I'm a research assistant at the Alliance of Biodiversity International and the CIAT. Today, I'm going to present the preliminary results we got from a global meta-analysis about the financial profitability of diversified farming systems. So it's widely acknowledged that conventional farming systems, meaning highly simplified farms with high external inputs requirements, are a major environmental threat, and that alternative farming approaches are needed. So there are dozens of scientific papers providing empirical evidence that shows diversified farming systems can mitigate the negative environmental impacts of conventional farming. So what is preventing farmers to make the transition from conventional to more diversified production systems? Well, part of the reason may be that diversified systems are less profitable, creating a barrier to change. Yet we found that there is a clear gap in the evidence of economic aspects of diversified farming systems, and therefore a lack of clarity on how costly or profitable these systems are compared to conventional farms. So to fill these gaps, we are conducting a global meta-analysis to see what is the financial profitability of diversified systems comparing to more simplified farming systems, and to explore how these responses vary across different variables. Well, our preliminary results are based on a database that includes more than 1,500 effect sizes from studies that compare the financial profitability of diversified and simplified farming systems in 31 countries around the world. And among our most interesting results, we found that on average, diversified farming systems presented significantly higher gross and net returns benefits than simplified farming systems. But these diversified systems were also more costly, probably because farmers need to invest in more supplies or type of management. We also found that diversified farming systems like crop rotation, intercropping, and combined practices like integrated crop livestock systems presented significantly higher net and gross incomes. But the implementation of combined practices presented also significantly higher related costs. Moreover, when we found that diversified farming systems that mix cereals like maize, wheat, and rice with other non-cereal crops like pulses, vegetables, or oils gave the highest net income benefit. But the total cost of implementing these systems were also higher. And when we look at the distribution of this data, we notice that the results for the different cereals with no cereals combination were based nearly always on studies analyzing combination of annual crops and studies analyzing crop rotation or intercropping. So our provisional results demonstrate that profits were actually higher in diversified systems than conventional ones. However, the financial cost of transitioning from simplified to more diversified farming systems are high. So farmers need policy and financial support to implement diversified farming systems. And this is particularly important in developing countries where, according to our database, diversified farming systems presented significantly higher net and gross returns, but also higher total costs, which is likely to be a barrier for many low-income or smallholders farms. And finally, financial outcomes for other diversified practices like agroforestry are difficult to define considering the data bias toward crop rotations and intercropping gaps in the study. So more field experiments are needed to document financial returns and costs of other diversified practices in poorly represented cropping systems and regions. Thank you very much.
Greetings to all. My name is Camilla Figueiredo, and I'm a researcher with a master's degree in environmental quality. I'm from Rio Grande do Sul, Brazil, and today we present my research named Agroecology Strategies to Promote Conservation Insights from Brazilian Small Farmers. I'm the main author, and other authors are Paola Schmidt Figueiredo and Lucia Schreiber. Our research question is, how small farmers implement conservation agricultural practices in Brazil? The purpose is to elucidate this lack of knowledge. And for this, interviews were conducted with two specialists from a government institution of technological support for Brazilian agricultural extension. The objectives were to characterize the agroecological aspects developed by small Brazilian agriculture preparedness, and to highlight the main strengths, weaknesses, and challenges to promote the conservation of the agrobiodiversity. Our outcomes. So, through this research, we evidenced that Brazilian small farmers are implementing these key aspects to develop the conservation of the agrobiodiversity. They are the green manure, the biomass generation, seeds bank, cooperativism, the biofertilization, food safety, the woman empowerment, the biological control, the agroforestry, culture diversification, organic compounds, reutilization, and green manure. Our research contributions to the Congress are that agroecological practices contribute to increase the environmental quality beyond the farms, to enhance presence of species, including animals endangered, is essential to promote these key aspects that we presented in the other slide. To increase soil nutrition and consequently improve quantity produced, diversity, food security, and farmers' incomes, these key aspects are essential. The cooperatives in Brazil contribute to seedling conservation and to more inputs availability. The agroecological practices increase the agrobiodiversity in the small farmings in Brazil through these practices listed in the slide before. So we thank you very much for your attention and desire to everyone a good Congress. Thank you.
Live.
Thank you very much for these fantastic presentations. Before we move on to the next speaker, my apologies for stating the wrong title for Steve Arquette's fantastic presentation. The correct title was Upscaling Food System Change for Healthier People and Planet. The next three presentations that we're going to hear are first by Camilla Figueiredo. She's a researcher by Sergey Miyadesh. He's a postdoctoral research associate at Newcastle University in the UK, and he will be talking about linking farming practices and human well-being in an agricultural growth corridor in Tanzania. Then this will be followed by a presentation by Graham Mayer from FAO. He's a senior agriculture officer talking about aquatic biodiversity and underrepresented sector playing catch up. And the last presentation of this morning of the session is by Professor Cao Yafu, former director of Zhenjiang Academy of Agricultural Sciences in China, and he will be talking about biodiversity agriculture practices in Daizhuang village.
Greetings, my name is Dr. Sergey Miyadesh. I am postdoctoral research associate at Newcastle University in the UK, and today I will be sharing results from a study linking agroecological practices and human well-being in Tanzania. More and more, we hear calls to shift the measurement of development outcomes away from simplistic economic metrics and towards the impacts on human well-being. There are also growing concerns on the long-term sustainability of industrialized farming models, as well as on our capacity to meet future food demand. Agroecological practices can help accomplish a transition towards more sustainable food systems without necessarily compromising on the levels of production. A food knowledge gap we currently have in the scientific literature is that there is limited empirical evidence of the impact that different land use management strategies have on the well-being of smallholder farmers in tropical and subtropical landscapes. To help address that gap, this research aims to produce new empirical evidence on the link between agroecology and human well-being in rural Tanzania, while also identifying the factors that are driving the uptake of those practices. More specifically, our two research questions are: do farmer socioeconomic factors and perceptions drive the uptake of our agroecological practices? And is higher uptake of those practices contributing to farmer well-being? Our study area is the northern part of Kilombero district in Morogoro, Tanzania, and this is an area that is important both in terms of food production and nature conservation priorities. The well-being index we developed uses 20 indicators along 5 different dimensions, and these indicators were selected through a participatory process with the local community. We were able to collect a total of 420 household surveys, and data analysis was done using linear mixed effect models. So our analysis shows that female farmers with higher perception of the benefits they get from nature that received farming advice in the last 3 years, that are landowners or that use different synthetic inputs in their farms, are more likely to have higher levels of agroecological practice uptake in their farms. As for the well-being analysis, it showed that younger farmers that are male, that have village responsibilities, that are members of a local group or association, such as a landing or a farming association, that have higher levels of food security in their households, that use different synthetic inputs and more agroecological practices in their farms, are more likely to have higher levels of well-being. So this analysis shows that and provides additional empirical evidence in support of the well-being benefits to smallholder farmers of the implementation of agroecological practices. It also shows that the combined application of both conventional and agroecological practices can still be beneficial to farmer well-being, by which I mean that even a partial transition to agroecology is still bringing benefits to smallholder farmers in terms of well-being. Results also show that smallholder farmer training and capacity building is fundamental to increase the uptake of sustainable practices. And here I mean not only technical training, but also increasing the awareness that farmers have of the benefits that they are receiving from nature, both on and around their farms. we conclude that more research is needed on the incentives and interventions that maximize benefits from agriculture to human well-being in a way that integrates food production and nature conservation goals and under diverse environmental, social, and economic conditions. Only by considering these different conditions will be possible to adjust the results to specific local contexts. We also conclude that a multidimensional well-being metric, particularly one that is developed in a participatory way with the local community, can be a valuable tool for measuring the impacts of nature positive solutions. I would like to thank the respondents to the survey and all the colleagues that participated in this research. Thank you.
Hello, everybody. My name is Graham Mayer, and I'm representing today the Food and Agriculture Organization of the UN, and I'm speaking to you from our headquarters in Rome. I'd like to talk today about aquatic biodiversity, make a case for it being a very important sector of agrobiodiversity, but also a very underrepresented sector. So why is aquatic diversity important? We all know that biodiversity underpins our food production systems, and if we don't manage it effectively, we compromise those systems. For aquatic diversity, we farm and we catch around 212 million tons total aquatic food production per year, valued at over $400 billion US. You can see from the graph on the right that all of the recent growth in aquatic food production has come from aquaculture. And indeed, currently, for our food production, 46% of animal production and 97% of plant production comes from aquaculture. And totally, aquaculture production for food now exceeds that from capture fisheries. We know that aquaculture is the fastest growing food production sector globally and has been for some years. But there is also a major regional imbalance in aquaculture production, with 92% of production coming from the Asian continent. Totally, aquatic food production represents 17% of animal protein consumed, and aquatic food is the most globally traded food commodity. So what do we know about aquatic diversity? And a lot of our current information comes from two recent reports from FAO, a global assessment of the world's biodiversity for food and agriculture, and more specifically, a publication on the state of the world's aquatic genetic resources for food and agriculture. We know that we farm around 700 species and we fish around 1,800 species. We recognize very strong links between farm genetic resources and wild relative genetic resources. We still harvest from the wild for farming, and also aquaculture either releases or deliberately introduces, or we have escapes from aquaculture which interact with wild relatives. One of the major features of aquatic genetic resources is our lack of information, and we even do not have standardized descriptions for many aquatic genetic resources, and this hampers our progress. And this lack of information particularly applies to the level below the species. We know that all farm species still exist in the wild, but some are under threat. We have very limited options for gene banking. Essentially, it's either live gene banks or cryopreservation for sperm only. Poor genetic management within seed supply systems is very commonplace, especially in the developing world. And because most aquatic species are recently domesticated over the last 2 to 4 decades, we have relatively few developed farmed types, such as strains and varieties. Furthermore, uptake of genetic improvement is relatively slow. And principally because we lack information, we have quite limited capacity for improving the management of genetic resources, and we have few genetic resource specific policies for aquatic resources. It's important to recognize that many of these features of aquatic diversity are somewhat different to similar features for terrestrial agrobiodiversity. So we cannot assume that measures, strategies, policies that we put in place and instruments that are applicable and developed with terrestrial agrobiodiversity in mind, we cannot assume that they apply equally well to aquatic diversity. Why do we think that aquatic biodiversity is underrepresented? As I have stated, aquatic genetic resources represent around 17% of human protein production, but I'd be reasonably confident to say that it will not represent 17% of the discussion at a conference like this on agrobiodiversity. If we look at the SDGs, SDG 2.5 is highly relevant to aquatic genetic diversity, but aquatic genetic resources are not considered in measuring progress against the indicators to the 2020 target. We have some better potential for inclusion of genetic resources in considering the post-2020 agenda, but this is going to be constrained by a lack of awareness and a lack of data and tools to develop indicators of the status of genetic resources in the aquatic environment. What is FAO doing to address these constraints? I'd love to talk in more detail, but I just talk about two measures. Firstly, we are about to release a prototype global information system for aquatic genetic resources called AquaGRIS, and FAO members are very likely to adopt at the end of this month a global plan of action for the conservation, sustainable use, and development of aquatic genetic resources for food production. And I'm happy to talk more on this as the session develops. Thank you very much.
Hello, I'm Jinhui from Professor Zhao Yafu's research team, who has been honored as a role model over the times for his contribution to the poverty alleviation cause in China. I'd like to thank the Congress Secretary for providing me the chance to introduce biodiversity agricultural practice, Daizhuang Village Experience. Daizhuang Village is located in Zhiyong City, Jiangsu Province, China, which has turned from a small poverty-stricken village to a moderate well-off one. Its population is around 2,800 with more than 267 hectares of ecological forest, 200 hectares of farmland, and 100 hectares of fruits, tea, and vegetable garden. Since 2001, we have alleviated the valley from poverty by developing agricultural biodiversity and producing organic agri-products. During the past 20 years, by adopting multi-plating, multi-breeding combination of plating and breeding, we achieved a big success in protecting and cultivating biodiversity. Plant economical forest fruit variety. We plant 30 economical fruit varieties that adapt favorable to local environment, improve the functionality and stability of the agro-ecosystem, and enhance the supply of high-quality products of the ecosystem. Select resource-saving rice varieties. We plant Yuguang rice variety, which has the advantage of short growth period, less fertilizer and water demand, less straw, easy to return to the field, disease and pest resistant, outstanding quality, and high import-output ratio. Explore and utilize local poultry and livestock resources. We explore and utilize local poor breed chicken and pig varieties to adjust the structure of species and make full use of local ecological resources. Restore native bee species. The development and the utilize of native Chinese honeybee helps to improve the quality and yield of vegetables, melons, and fruits. Introduce natural animal resources for bee control. We introduced the water peanut leaf beetle, native to South America, to control alligator weeds. Through 20 years hard work, a rich and colorful ecological landscape model of small watershed in health area has been formed, including hilltops and steep slopes, imitation of natural forest ecosystem, gentle slope, organic forest and fruits plus grass plus livestock ecosystem, fields in the valley bottom, organic rice plus grass plus livestock ecosystem. Agricultural biodiversity practice also brings us remarkable benefits, both ecologically and economically. Biodiversity survey results in 2017 showed that 127 species of animals of 10 classes and 31 orders were monitored in the ecosystem, while only 20 kinds of animals were found in the neighboring village. The comparative data showed that the conventional paddy fields saw organic matter increased by 24%, with continued improvement of overall agricultural productivity. The per capita net income has reached 34,000 yuan in 2020, 6 times higher than 10 years ago. Our biodiversity agricultural practice in Daizhuang Village provides a model of protecting and cultivating biodiversity and repairing agricultural ecosystem for the vast hilly and mountainous area in China. That's all. Thank you for your attention. Looking forward to welcome you in Daizhuang Valley.
Thank you so much for these exciting and very insightful presentations. I see in the stream that we have already quite a number of questions. I would like to actually start off with a comment by Julian Gonsalves. He said that demonstrating the profitability is indeed a key factor in farmers themselves for scaling agroecology. Now, the question is directed towards Andrea. So some of the systems that you mentioned, transitioning from simple to diverse cropping systems, only will manifest these cost effects over time. So I was wondering if you have any indication of the time effect for these transitioning costs.
Hi, thank you very much for the question. Yes, we actually have that information, and we are planning to use that as a moderator. Unfortunately, the database is, we are continue building the database, so we don't have that information yet, but we are going to analyze that information. Thank you.
Thank you for the answer. So maybe I can direct the next question to Graham. We have a question: what are the interactions between aquatic and crop genetic resources? Feed development, for instance?
Thank you. That's a good question. I think feed is probably the main interaction. Traditionally, ingredients for aqua feeds, and please understand that aquaculture, some of it is fed, but a lot of it is also unfed, like shellfish. A lot of oyster farming, it doesn't involve feed at all. But traditionally, feed has come from marine-sourced ingredients, but that puts an additional pressure on aquatic biodiversity through the fishing of fish meal, for example, to feed. So there's been a transition, especially in some industries like salmon, which is very dependent on feed, a transition to using plant-based proteins. And so increasingly aquafeed diets are using more plant genetic resources. Soy probably is the major one. And there's even exploration now of using genetic tools to develop crops that are more suitable for and better for aquafeed diets, so they don't have anti-nutritional ingredients in them, and they're more palatable to the fish. But if you're dealing with a carnivorous species, there's a limit to how high you can put the plant feed content, but it's definitely increasing in that direction.
Thank you for that answer, Graham. I actually would like to follow up with a question. So based on from what I understand, the predictions for edible food from the sea are increasing by up to 74%. So can you very briefly comment on how this development could be made more sustainable, the whole use of aquatic biodiversity? Just a very few bullet points, maybe.
Sure. I mean, I think that's correct that there is an ever-increasing demand, and you could see from the graph in my presentation that seafood or aquatic food production is keeping pace with population growth, but all of that growth is coming from aquaculture, and I think that is the future. So I think the key to meeting that demand is the growth of sustainable aquaculture, and obviously we want to ensure that continuing growth, first of all, it becomes more geographically diverse, and we're constantly looking at developing new species. But we've hardly started with the development of species that we're already farming. So I think a major component of sustainable management of diversity in the future will actually be the development of our species and our farm types for aquaculture, because that will enable them to be better adapted to our farming systems, and therefore production efficiency can increase. So we should be able to get significant increases in production without necessarily increasing the consumption and the environmental footprint of aquaculture. So definitely development is one. The second one would be just becoming much more aware of the genetic diversity that we farm in aquaculture, and we're trying to address that through the development of this information system, so we can have a record of national diversity and global diversity, which is really a starting point for being able to institute effective management. And the Global Plan of Action has a lot of measures in it that should improve management. So we're very optimistic that if we can understand and manage and develop our genetic resources, that this growth of aquaculture should be highly sustainable. Thank you.
Thank you, Graham. Maybe Steve, I can direct a question to you. So you presented case studies from Bhutan, and there's a number of questions on how applicable your findings in rice there, in the rice production systems there, would be applicable to other countries, to other settings, to other growing scenarios.
I think the policy that I showed in the simulation is exploratory. It hasn't been done anywhere, to my knowledge, in agriculture, but the model was built in such a way as it could be applied to other countries. As I think I mentioned early in the presentation, actually the modeling project is part of a much bigger project consisting of some 80 countries. So hopefully there'll be some opportunities to put some of the model to work in other places.
Thank you. And maybe a follow-up question. So there was a question on the model development. So there are two important aspects in this integrated model to be considered. These include availability of labor, as organic ecological agriculture is more labor intensive, and the availability of alternative technologies for organic farming. Do you think these can be included?
Yes, actually the model that was shown is a sector model, and this model will be nested into a larger national model that does include labor. So to some extent, the impacts of labor will be in place, and also, for example, migration from rural to urban phenomenon. On the availability of technology for organic, that isn't explicitly in the model at this point, but I think it would be interesting to take that in consideration as a constraining factor, especially if some of the dynamic factors such as time lags for upscaling the availability of the technology to farmers could be included. So that's an interesting question, and it's food for thought. Thank you.
Thank you very much. Maybe I can go on for a question for Camilla. So how do you think, what needs to be incentivized for farming cooperatives to practice agroecology?
In my point of view, the cooperatives, especially in Brazil, have a special role in the promotion of the agrobiodiversity. They are an important agent in the promotion of seeds banking, the chains of seeds into farms, especially for the small farmers. And as I have mentioned in other questions from the audience, there are no subsidies from the government. So the people engaged in the agriculture, especially organics and other like that, they are very engaged in cooperatives, and they collaborated into them with knowledge, and they share their knowledge and their culture. They are very motivated, and they are self-sufficient and promoting these actions, because they don't have any subsidies in terms of not just financial terms, but in terms of technological knowledge. So it is more something about self-identity and culture than other things.
Thank you. That's very interesting, and I think it's a very important fact to point out here: the self-identity and the knowledge exchange for implementation of agroecology. We have a question that is open to all now, and that is: what is the role and importance of media to shift our vision about the relationship with nature and the way we interact with it, including the way we produce food? So it's a fairly broad question, but certainly a very relevant one. Sergio, would you like to take that one?
Yeah, sure, I can contribute on that. I think that media can for sure have a role on bringing higher awareness of the benefits that nature is providing in these agroecological systems. And this, we can see that has a real impact on how smallholder farmers will make their decisions on their farms. So it's a very valuable role to have. Additionally, they also can not only translate knowledge directly from researchers and translate them themselves, but also provide platforms and even training for researchers to share their work. And by increasing this knowledge exchange and capacity building, they would be having a very important role in the development of agroecological landscapes, in my perspective.
Thank you, Sergio. Are there any other additions that you want to make? Yes, Graham, please.
Yeah, it's an interesting question. Actually, we're having conversations at the moment about our communication on genetic resources, and I think when I read mainstream media, I see biodiversity now is quite a mainstream term, and I think most of the population now understands what it is. But generally speaking, I think it's almost always presented in the context of species diversity, and quite often species diversity or species richness in the wild. So I think we can, as experts, can help by trying to broaden the understanding of biodiversity in the media, that it's about genetic diversity. It's about genetic diversity within our food production systems as well as in the wild. So, but I think the media has a very important role to play, because if we get the right messages out through the media, then we create, if you like, a demand for more effective management of biodiversity, as we're seeing now, I guess, for the demand for action on climate change. So I think it's important to build good relationships and communicate very effectively with media, because they do play an important role. But I think they need to expand the perspective of what is agrobiodiversity.
Thank you very much, Graham. I think that was a very nice discussion after your excellent presentations. Let me thank you one more time for joining this session and for providing your insights from across the world. on all these important topics. In the next point, we will now be moving on to the panel discussion. So
Thank you.
Thank you very much.
Thank you.
Thank you.
Welcome back, everybody, to our panel discussion. It has been a great discussion with our speakers in the previous session. So let me now welcome our panelists and give you a brief introduction. So we have on the panel Professor Andrew Lowy. He's a professor of plant conservation biology at the University of Adelaide. He has discovered some lost forests, championed to eliminate illegally logged timber in global supply chains, served as the United Nations Office of Drug and Crime, and is the lead author of the Intergovernmental Platform for Biodiversity Ecosystem Services, focusing on land degradation and restorations. We then also have Sheng Fan. He is a chair professor at the College of Economics and Management at the China Agricultural University in Beijing, and former Director General of the International Food Policy Research Institute. Professor Fan is also a member of the Global Panel on Agriculture and Food Systems for Nutrition, on the Advisory Council of the Oxford Martin School at the University of Oxford, and on the board of the Syngenta Foundation for Sustainable Agriculture. He's also on the Council of Advisors for the World Food Prize, and he serves as the member of the lead group for the Scaling Up Nutrition movement appointed by the United Nations Secretary General. And then we have Julian Oram. He is the Senior Director at Mighty Earth, and he has more than 2 decades of experience working on ecological agriculture and sustainable supply chains. He leads Mighty Earth research and advocacy on natural rubber and cocoa, developing campaigns to radically reduce the harmful ecological and social impacts that some of these tropical forest commodities have. He has also previously worked in senior roles, for instance, with Global Witnesses, Greenpeace International, and ActionAid UK. And I don't think we have our 4th speaker here already. I will introduce her, and hopefully Susanna will have a chance to see you on the video shortly. So Susanna Ngo Ayok, I'm sorry if I'm not pronouncing your name correctly, is the Managing Director for Africa for Biodiversity International in Seattle. And amongst her previous positions, she worked at the World Bank before, for Bill and Melinda Gates Foundation, and recently also for the World Cocoa Foundation. And in this World Cocoa Foundation role, she led the stakeholder engagement program implementation and the Cocoa Livelihoods program in Ivory Coast. And she has ample working experience with the private sector partners, national governments, and farmers. So from this broad panel, what you can definitely see is we cover a number of geographies, and we cover a number of very interesting backgrounds. So we can just continue the discussion that has been already quite broad in the previous section. So let me just give you some background on the 3 questions. So we're actually at a transition point where agricultural systems have to change from intensified systems to sustainable agriculture. And in the EU, for instance, we have set targets in the Green Deal to increase the total amount of organic agriculture to 25%, but we will be left with intensified agricultural systems to quite a large extent. So now my question here is, what do you see as the most important and significant scientific advances to transform food production systems that benefit people and planet at scale? And in more general terms, how do you envision the future of agriculture production systems based on agrobiodiversity? Andy, do you want to go first?
Sure, I'll give it a go. So thanks very much, and thanks to the organisers. This is a great meeting to be part of. I'm based here in Australia, and we've seen some really big changes and mounting changes in food production. And I think there's 2 diverging influences on that. The first one is a kind of extensification of food production, and the other one is an intensification. And they're very different drivers for those different systems. If we look at extensive food production systems, which are largely around livestock production, grazing in the rangelands, what we're seeing is the adoption of opportunities, particularly around carbon credits and carbon sequestration, both with above ground vegetation, but also increasingly now with soil carbon. And the markets for soil carbon are driving an increase of revegetation and also in many cases support for ecosystem services within those types of systems. So we're seeing a much more sustainable farming system develop in those kind of areas. But these areas tend to be low rainfall and far from the cities. Around the cities and around areas with good connections to markets, we're seeing a large intensification of food production. Some very high-tech systems which are developing. solar panels, which are being used to desalinate seawater and basically generate large high-tech glass houses that are basically off-grid for energy and water through those systems. Close to cities, close to urban farming, multi-story connections. And also we're seeing quite an increase in kind of plant-based protein produced through these types of systems. So I'll pause there, Thomas, and give some of the other speakers a chance to talk. But certainly from our perspective, those are the two main drivers. And really the technology and the research piece that's underpinning those are really quite different for those sectors.
Thank you. Julian, do you want to continue and contribute?
Sure. Thank you, Thomas. And thank you for the organizers for inviting Mighty Earth to participate in this really interesting discussion. I really enjoyed the contributions of the presentations from Andrea and Camilla and Sergio and Graham earlier. The keynote speech from Raj Patel was very inspiring, I thought. So it's great to be part of this. As you mentioned, we work as an organization largely on tropical commodities and trying to sort of de-link the connection between tropical commodity production and ecosystem loss and forest destruction. So my particular area of research has been on rubber and cocoa, as you mentioned in my introduction. And what we're seeing, so these are very interesting sectors because both cocoa and natural rubber are largely produced by smallholder producers. About 85–90% is smallholder dominated. However, they are commodity crops which feed into a global market, right? That they're not consumed at the point of production. Rubber is not even a food commodity, obviously. So you've got this dynamic here and this tension between a smallholder production system feeding into a global commodity market. And over the course of recent years, we've seen an incredible increase in the connection between the production of these commodities and deforestation, as well as other environmental issues such as water pollution, habitat destruction, increased carbon emissions, as well as human rights issues and land rights issues. So a host of issues there. Now, the industries that buy these commodities have become increasingly aware of these issues and these problems, and has tried to take steps, as Suzanne, I'm sure, will be able to speak to address these problems. But there's often a challenge, which is coming back to the core of your question about how to do so, how to develop more sustainable production systems for commodities that are ultimately bought and consumed very far away from their points of production. And what we're seeing with initiatives like, what the World Cocoa Foundation has been doing, the Cocoa and Forest Initiative, the Global Platform for Sustainable Natural Rubber, the Chinese initiatives to promote sustainable rubber, is that the policies and the ideas are sort of there, but the how-to level on the ground is still, a ways behind. So, for instance, agroforestry, which is a very popular technique to try and get more sustainable production systems in tree commodity crops, and Thomas, in which I know you're a very notable expert, is a way forward. But how do you do that at local level, replicated across all these different agroecological and sociological zones where these commodities are produced? So for me, that's the greatest challenge that we're facing right now. Thank you.
Thank you, Julian, for pointing out that implementation gap that we are also seeing in various ways when we look at technology, but we can talk about this a bit later as well. Who wants to go next?
Well, I can do that if Suzanne is still working on her connection. Yes, thank you, Thomas. I think innovation also comes from policy, governance, and so on. So it's not just technology. I wanted to briefly mention 3 areas that we really needed to innovate. One is that we must innovate policy to change our current subsidy policy. Our current subsidy provides almost free water, subsidized fertilizers, pesticides to produce more grains like wheat, rice, and maize at the cost of our environment, particularly the loss of biodiversity. Now, there is evidence to show that 60% of the biodiversity loss or the risk of losing biodiversity comes from food and agriculture systems. So it is a problem. Now, how do we repurpose? So we needed to cut down the substitution of water on fertilizers, and chemicals, and then use that money to support more nutritious, healthy, and sustainable food, particularly to give farmers some incentive to protect biodiversity. The farmers need to have that incentive. So that's number one. Number two is the governance. If you wanted to use, it's a food system approach to bring health, nutrition, environment, let's say climate change, all this together. Now we needed to innovate our governance system at a global level, national level, even community level. At a national level, at a global level, we have FAO, UNEP, UNDP, all this, they are working in silos. Can we bring them together? I think UN Food Systems Summit held in New York in September, it was a good, let's say, initiative to bring all the sectors together at a global level. At a national level, we should do the same. So the Ministry of Agriculture, Ministry of Environment, Ministry of Health and Finance, climate change, all have to work together to develop coordinated policy strategies. And then down to the regional level, provincial level, prefecture level. The third innovation is, well, I shouldn't say the innovation, is more changes of our behavior. So can we change our diets from, it's a meat-based to plant-based diets and cut down the consumption of all this sort of unsustainable meat, unsustainable grains, and to produce more fruits, to consume more fruits, vegetables, nuts, seafood, and so on. So in this case, our diets will be healthy to ourselves, but also more environmentally friendly. They cut down the emission, cut down the loss of biodiversity, cut down the overuse of water.
Thank you, Shengen. You're frozen, but I think you were about to come to an end with your excellent points, and I'm very glad that you pointed out the dietary change, which I also do think is one of the key modes of action for change. Susanna, I see that you're online, and maybe we cannot see you, which is not a problem if there are internet connections on your side, but if you can make a contribution to that first question. How do you see significant scientific advances, and in more general terms, how do you see the future of agricultural systems based on agrobiodiversity? That would be fantastic.
Can you hear me?
Yes, loud and clear.
So no, never mind if you can't see me. I think Julian said it. I work very extensively in cocoa and with cocoa smallholders. And what we've seen here is the fact that they're trying to make a living. And that from that perspective, to be able to adopt some of the innovations that will, link to better practices and enhance some of the knowledge gap that we have in the sector, makes it very difficult. The cost of nature positive agriculture is very high. And some of the technologies that are available today are not at the reach of the smallholder farmers, that they are in cocoa, rubber, or even core food security crops. People are trying to make a living. So I think that there is a real knowledge gap from all the innovations that we have, from all the commitments and the positioning that we have, and the visibility that that the Food System Summit has given to nature positive agriculture, and to the importance of agroecology and preserving the nature and making sure that we are reverting some of the agricultural occupied land to nature. But we also have the issue of having the resources to integrate more diversity in our cropping mechanisms, to make sure that we have some pesticide neutral type of entrants for the farmers to grow their food, and also that we have also the political environment and greater investment from the private sector in order to make sure that those changes are arriving, because the first mechanism of extension delivery services at the moment are in some of those sectors and crops we were talking about, like rubber and cocoa, are actually the private sector, who will invest in having trainings of farmers and who will infuse the change. We've seen it in cocoa in the last 20 years, the adoption of farmer field school and the improvement of the implementation of good agricultural practices, but with the purpose of increasing productivity. It was okay. It was very much okay, 50 years ago to address some of the challenges of food security to produce cheap calories. But now we need definitively to change the way that we produce, the way that we engage with the farmers, the way that us as scientists are actually providing services and technologies that can be adopted by the extension services, by the private sectors, by the farmers themselves, in order to produce better and take into account health, earth, and productivity of a farmer.
Fantastic. Thank you, Susanna. Excellent comment. Julian, you would like to add on to this, and maybe I can also use this as a transition, and you could comment on the knowledge transfer between, the existing knowledge in science and how this can be used by farmers. If you can use that as a transition point, would be great.
Well, in fact, Thomas, thank you. That's exactly where I wanted to go next. So it's you fed me a line I wanted to speak about in any case. On the basis of Suzanne's excellent comments. Yeah, I think this is actually where the real, the meat of the challenge lies, pardon the pun with meat. But yeah, in terms of, no one understands their local agroecosystem better than the farmers who farm those systems, right? Now, at the same time, there's a great deal of scientific knowledge about how production systems can be both improved in terms of productivity, but also fundamentally also in terms of sustainability, maximizing soil conditions, water conditions, etc. And this conjunction between farmer knowledge and scientific knowledge is where I think we're going to see the most progress, not just with the commodity crops that I deal with, but I think in agriculture in general over the years to come. And it has to come from the farmers themselves. So when we talk about agroforestry now, in rubber, in cocoa, we talk about farmer-led agroforestry, because you need to understand first and foremost, what are the needs of the communities that the scientists are wanting to work with? What are their drivers? What are the incentives? What are the things that are going to, essentially, incentivize them to adopt these sorts of systems? It can't just be because, we as scientists think it's better than monoculture production systems or whatever it is, or because we see the need to cut down on chemical inputs. So the farmers need to be leading that process, and we as scientists, our role as researchers is to understand their needs, to work with them to sort of maximize their existing knowledge and to use scientific interventions to augment and help them to transform their systems, hopefully with the support, as Dr. Fan was saying, of policy interventions and extension services taking more of a lead role in that. So yeah, and of course the private sector.
Thank you very much. We have only 5 minutes left for the closing remarks, actually. So if anybody wants to make a very short comment on, a very distinct way forward and how we can bridge overall, the gap from the current systems to these agrobiodiversity based sustainable systems, for one last quick comment, that would be the time, but it would have to be very quick. Andy,
I'll make a quick comment, because I think many of the systems that we're seeing are now changing at a rate that we haven't seen since the Industrial Revolution. But a lot of the changes during the Industrial Revolution were really around optimizing production and driving down costs. Whereas now we're really seeing changes that are reflecting sustainability issues. And part of that is because of the buying power of a much more choosy base of customer, and also the potential for technologies to be able to track and identify sustainable products. So we're kind of putting the tools in the hands of the consumer to be able to make choice on some of these products. Still comes down to cost, still expect those products to cost the same, even though they're sustainable. Of course, policy is important for driving that change, but I think for the first time, we do have a chance to really drive these sustainable systems because of the direct link to the consumer at the end of the day.
I wanted to add one point, that is that technological innovations in the past were very much focused on yield enhancing. Today, we must promote multiple wind technologies, yield enhancing, but also sustainability, absolutely, and nutrition. And we have the technology that can combine all this together, cut down the emission, cut down the fertilizer use, cut down where the water use, land use, and bring the nutrition into like a body fortification, biofortification, and so on. So we must have multiple wind technologies instead of just one single wind. Thank you.
Thank you all for this excellent discussion. I think we won't have really time for a comprehensive wrap up. I just want to flag 3 main points. So I think what is very important is that we see this divergence of extensive and intensive cropping system in the future that will be able to address these agrobiodiversity managed systems to a different extent. We urgently have to bridge the knowledge gap between science and farmers and other stakeholders. And I think it's quite important to look into the innovation in terms of policy to make, to make this transition towards sustainable agriculture. I leave it there. And I thank the panel again for an excellent discussion. It was really enjoyable for my side. I also would like to thank the organizers, of course, for putting this, and everybody for the tech support. So thank you very much, and enjoy the conference. And I hope you can join the next session.
Thank you, all the panelists. It's a great work. Let's continue to push this transition.
Thank you all.
Thank you.
Thank you.
The Amazon is the most biodiverse terrestrial ecosystem on our planet. Its vastness, density, and beauty are breathtaking. Besides the ocean, it is one of the largest CO2 reservoirs in the world and stores 20% of all fresh water. But the Amazon is threatened by the needs of a growing population. Forests disappear to produce minerals, food, and fuel. Earlier this year, researchers calculated that the Amazon is now more likely to contribute to rather than mitigate climate change, because it will store fewer greenhouse gases than it emits. And that is mostly due to massive deforestation. Yet, there are ways to meet human needs by planting trees instead of cutting them down. This is what Camino Verde has been doing for over a decade, because we know the Amazon can be restored. We are a non-profit organization based in the Peruvian Amazon. In the last 15 years, we have created nurseries and planted diverse polyculture agroforestry systems. Our regenerative mission has led us to plant over 100,000 trees, reforest 100 hectares of rainforest, and protect 100 hectares of primary forest, the source of our seeds. On what used to be degraded land, trees now grow that provide us with food, timber, and medicine, while mimicking a natural forest. We planted trees that serve both nature and humans, and on our regenerative farms grow more than 400 different species. Let us introduce you to a few of them, starting with our favorite fruits. We grow coconut palms and citrus trees such as lemon and orange and a variety of different types of bananas. But especially, we grow species you might never have heard of. These include copoaçu. Copoaçu is a relative of cacao. It has a sour and aromatic pulp. The seeds can be used to make chocolate. Pihuayo, probably our favorite of all, is a palm fruit that tastes like an oily potato. Eaten with a bit of salt, it's just heaven. Umari looks like a mango, but it's harder to peel. It has only little pulp, but it tastes like the most aromatic avocado you've ever eaten. Zapote is a lot richer in pulp. It tastes like a mix of bananas, squash, and even melon. Besides fruits, we grow medicinal species used traditionally to heal all sorts of conditions. Have you ever heard of Sangre de Grado, the dragon blood tree that produces a red sap incredibly effective at healing wounds and ulcers? Or maybe Copaiba, a tree whose trunk is filled with an oleo resin that is said to be antiseptic, analgesic, and more. The pulp of pate fruit can be boiled down to a syrup used against coughs and pulmonary infections. There is a variety of ways to process medicinal plants. You can put the bark in alcohol to create medicinal extracts, or take a tea by drying up the leaves. But even more interestingly, an important activity here at the farm is distillation. One of the main species we distill is Brazilian rosewood. In the 20th century, rosewood was cut down for European perfumery, fueled in part by the success of Chanel No. 5, until it was nearly extinct.
Every woman alive wants Chanel No. 5. So give her Chanel No. 5 in the classic bottle.
After a 5-year search for seeds, Camilla Figueiredo was able to plant the first rosewood trees in 2013. A sustainable method was developed to extract rosewood essential oil without destroying the plant. Today, we are growing our impact by planting trees with local farmers and native communities. In 2021 alone, we planted trees with 116 families. Rosewood essential oil is in demand on the international market at a high price point. This allows the farmers we work with to generate a steady source of
Symposium Roundtable on Diversity on Farms and Climate Resilience for Enhancing Ecosystem Service Delivery and Maintaining Production. My name is Bea Maas. I'm a conservation scientist, agroecologist, and science communicator, currently based at the University of Vienna in Austria, and working internationally in the field of agroecology and conservation science. In our work, we use transdisciplinary approaches to improve the general understanding and management of sustainable agriculture, and we focus on agroforestry systems and management of ecosystem services through approaches that actually integrate knowledge and skills from different disciplines. And today, it's also a great pleasure to have Rina Ralonen here, who will help me to co-moderate the session, and she will shortly introduce herself. Hi, Rina.
Hello, good morning, good afternoon, and good evening to everyone. So I'm Rina Jalonen from the Alliance, calling in from Malaysia this evening. And I'm working on forest and landscape restoration and livelihood improvement with partners across South and Southeast Asia. And as Bea mentioned, I will be working behind the scenes today to make sure that your questions get picked up and communicated to the presenters. So much looking forward to inspiring discussions today. Thank you.
Thank you, Rina. Yeah, exactly. It's a huge pleasure for us, for me to moderate the session together with our presenters here, with our panelists, and with you, the audience. So we will look at exactly these topics. How can we combine biodiversity conservation and food production? And we look forward also to answer your questions that you are heartily invited to post into the chat here. As an introduction, I also would like to emphasize that this morning in the inspiring keynote presentation of Professor Patel, this presentation left no doubt that high levels of biodiversity also can support ecosystem resilience. So the ability of ecosystems to cope with certain levels of change, of impact, of disturbance, before those systems change into other systems with other functions. And we, as a human society, want to maintain resilient ecosystems and agricultural services and systems because we depend on ecosystem services vitally. And importantly, we are quite limited in our ability to adapt to disturbances. As we can see, for example, through responses to the recent health situations, responses to global climate changes, and also the global population growth and our challenge and our challenging question, how to feed 9 billion people in the not so far future. So we should prepare for our future through transformations towards more sustainable food production systems. And integrating biodiversity will be key to achieve the global sustainable development goals in the future. But also this keynote this morning and our knowledge in agroecology leaves no doubt that simply knowing about these facts is not enough. Doing gaps in agroecology and conservation science are also part of my main research interests, and they will be part in our discussions today. In our most recent work, for example, we could show that the perspectives of farmers and scientists towards agricultural biodiversity, ecosystem services, and agricultural decision-making can be very different. They can be even pointing into opposite directions. And to achieve sustainability in agriculture and overcome practices that are currently considered as the main threat to biodiversity globally, we need to understand those different perspectives on sustainable agriculture, and we need to address them in ecology, society, and in economy to be truly sustainable. In this roundtable, we'll take a deeper look into these topics. We have put together an exciting session program for you. And in the next hour and a bit, we will have 3 sub-sessions. First, we will hear 6 short presentations on diverse set of different topics. And please, you as an audience, feel free to ask questions on those presentations in the chat, and we will address them in the Q&A session coming after that. And then in the third and final part of this session, we will discuss the topics and presentations with a group of 4 distinguished panelists. So I'm very much looking forward to this. And we'll now start and open the floor to our presenters and introduce our first 3 abstract presenters. The first will be Nancy Pirina Benitez Alfaro from National University of Engineering, talking about traditional systems as a providers of Peruvian quality seeds for family farming. followed by David Singania from Flasco in Ecuador, who will talk about the determinants of agrobiodiversity and a perspective from the Andes. And then third, we will hear a talk by Viviana Cesarelli from Biodiversity International in Italy on climate change tolerant genotypes to promote the adaptation of cacao cultivation to climate change in Peru. I'm very excited, looking forward to these presentations, and thank you for your attention. Have an inspiring congress.
Hello, my name is Viviana Ceccarelli, and I'm a research fellow at the Alliance Biodiversity International CIAT for the Lima office in Peru. In this presentation, I will present our study about climate change tolerant genotypes to promote the adaptation of cacao cultivation to climate change in Peru. So we know that cacao cultivation is expected to be impacted by climate change, and tolerant genotypes are the most promising adaptation option to climate change. On the other hand, we also know that Peru has a wide genetic diversity of cacao, as this country occurs within the center of origin of this species. Therefore, in this study, we aim to identify climate change tolerant genotypes in Peru to support adaptation of cacao cultivation to climate change. More specifically, the study had three objectives. First, to assess the future impact of climate change on cacao in Peru. Second, to identify areas where climate change tolerant genotypes are present. And third, to develop an online tool to help cacao farmers to select propagation material for climate change adaptation on their farms. And overall, in this study, we used a suitability modeling methodology, and we also performed future projection for several climate change scenarios. As mentioned, the first objective was to assess the future impact of climate change on cacao in Peru. As you can see from the figure, from the modeling results, we found that cultivated cacao will experience a net contraction of its suitable area in future, while wild cacao will mostly remain suitable and actually further expand under climate change. Therefore, it is clear that cacao cultivation is vulnerable to climate change in Peru, while partial adaptation could come from cacao wild populations. Then the second objective of the study was to identify areas where climate change tolerant genotypes are present. To this aim, we identified within the distribution of cultivated and wild cacao areas where cacao population currently live under the most extreme climatic condition, such as highest potential evapotranspiration or lowest precipitation of driest quarter. This population may be already tolerant to climate change. So we performed some collection mission to collect propagation materials from this cacao population. And we are currently testing the collected genotypes into climate chamber experiments. Next step will be to identify the most tolerant genotypes and introduce them in farmer fields or in the longer term into breeding programs. Finally, the third objective was to develop an online tool to help farmers to select propagation material. So we developed this tool called cacaodiversity.org. The tool is currently available online, and in the tool it's possible to select the coordinates of a farm, and the tool will return an automatic report with information about how climate change will impact cacao cultivation in the farm in the future, and also will provide a list of nurseries where to source propagation materials tolerant to climate change for the farm. Now, I would like to conclude this presentation with a few considerations about how this research contributes to the Agrobiodiversity Congress. So in this study, we aim to use and conserve cacao genetic diversity in Peru, so cacao agrobiodiversity, to support the adaptation of cacao cultivation to climate change, and in this way also to improve the livelihood of local cacao farmers. And these, of course, are within the goals of the Agrobiodiversity Congress. Now, although we identified these genotypes within Peru, given its high cacao genetic diversity, the result of this research will benefit not only Peru, but also Latin America and other cacao-producing countries in Africa and Asia. For instance, if these genotypes will be introduced into breeding programs. So with this, I would like to conclude my presentation. If you want to read more about our research, you can consult this paper that we publish on diversity and distribution. And so with this, I conclude my presentation and I thank you for your attention.
Hello. First of all, I want to thank the forum for the selection to present my study entitled Traditional System as Providers of Quality Seeds, Peruvian Evidence in High Diversity Crops for Home Consumption. In Peru, traditional or ancestral production is concentrated in the Andes, in a subsystem of highly vulnerable family agriculture where 95% of farmers use native seed, historically domesticated and selected each agricultural season with local criteria. These systems have gained global relevance due to the provision of food security, nutritional quality, and adaptation to climate change. Despite this, the quality of the seeds of the traditional system is not yet fully recognized in the Peruvian political and regulatory frameworks. It is denoted in agricultural policies as synonymous in the terms of certified seed and quality seeds, and their promotion as the only alternative to achieve increasing yields in the field. Under this criterion, policymakers usually consider that seeds that do not come from a certified production system tend to reduce their yields. Given this, it is worth asking whether traditional seed production systems really have diminishing returns that they are detrimental to their quality. For this characterization, the study has selected two crops, Cucurbita fichifolia and Cassicum pubescens, two crops of high national diversity, exclusively traditional production systems, and an historical legacy linked to their gastronomic uses. The study methodology considers a descriptive analysis of the cultivation spaces based on the 2019 National Agrarian Survey and the statistical inference analysis. The T-student test of a single sample and a single path was used to determine of the mean the sample was higher than the census mean, basing National Agricultural Census in 2012. The national spaces with the greatest diversity of all crops have been chosen, both located in the Andes, in the southern zone in the case of Cucurbita fichifolia, and in the central Andes in the case of Cassicum pubescens. The results show a radical growth of the surface of both crops, in particular in Cassicum pubescens. According to the trend analysis, it is evident that both crops show increasing yields. This growth does not respond to greater technical assistance, where the attention gaps are almost total in both crops, in particular, the care of seed safety. The social characteristics of both areas differ, in that the producers of Cucurbita fichifolia are Quichua speakers and mainly intended for self-consumption, while the producers of Cassicum pubescens are Spanish speakers who are mainly intended for the market. In both cases, the production is carried out in dry land and it is in charge of a population that exceeds 45 years. The statistical results show a normal distribution in both crops, adjusted to the theoretical line. The Shapiro-Wilk normality test was also applied, with which it is not rejected that the data come from a normal distribution. The inference analysis show in both cases that the estimated mean is significantly higher than the census mean. From the findings, it is concluded that there is evidence of growth in the yields of these two crops under traditional seed systems in the last 10 years. This contradicts the definition of quality seeds in the regulatory frameworks and the agricultural policy of Peru. That is, there are seeds that area, nor part of the formal systems, will have significant growth in the yields despite not having technical assistance and counting only with local selection criteria. For this reason, it is recommended to analyze other native crops and apply this evidence to carry political advocacy that recognize the sustained yields of this production system as a quality criterion. Thank you very much for your attention.
Hello, I'm David Singaña Tapia. I'm in Latacunga, Ecuador, South America. I'm a master's student of Flaxo, Ecuador, and I'm an associate researcher at Instituto de Estudios Ecuatorianos. My abstract's name is The Determinants of Agrobiodiversity, a Perspective from the Andes. The Green Revolution spread around the world, and South America was one of the main territories in which it took hold. This figure shows that from 1961 to 2019, the area dedicated to territory cash crops such as bananas, soybeans, and corn has always been higher than the area dedicated to more than 110 food crops. But the gap increased since 1961, where there were 39 million hectares more destinated to cash crops in front of 2019, where this difference reached 83 million hectares. In the same year, more than 60% of the area was dedicated to cash crops, which represented less than 25% of the total crops and varieties. An increase in the area dedicated to cash crops is evident, but although at a slower phase, the area dedicated to food crops has also increased. In this context, this study asks, what are the characteristics that make some farms have more agrobiodiversity than others? And to identify these characteristics to suggest public policy that favors the increase of agrobiodiversity on Ecuadorian farms. The objectives are to study the factors that increase the level of agrobiodiversity in Ecuadorian farms, to analyze the difference by natural region in the agrobiodiversity on farms, to determine gender differences in farm agrobiodiversity levels. For this purpose, a multiple regression model was estimated with information from 2020 continuous survey of agricultural surface and production. The dependent variable was the Margalef index, which is an agrobiodiversity index, which is calculated by the logarithm of the quotient between the number of crops and the land area. The independent variables were grouped into three categories: farmer characteristics, access to services, and spatial information. The results show that farms managed by men have 21% less agrobiodiversity than farms managed by women. Likewise, the indigenous ethnic group has higher levels of agrobiodiversity than the other existing ethnic groups. Similarly, those who report no education have higher levels of agrobiodiversity compared to those who have completely primary, secondary, or higher education. Additionally, the availability of irrigation increases agrobiodiversity by 17% compared to those who don't have irrigation. On the other hand, those who don't have access to technical assistance have 17% more agrobiodiversity than those who do. Geographically, both the coast and the Amazon region show lower levels of agrobiodiversity compared to the highlands. This may be associated with the dedication of the coastal area extensive export crops such as bananas, cacao, and coffee. Finally, this study shows that the farms located in highland regions show higher levels of agrobiodiversity compared to the coastal and Amazon region, which makes the highland region an interesting area to study. This research shows the need to focus public policy towards irrigation programs to increase the levels of agrobiodiversity. It was also evidence that technical assistance programs should change their approach since most of them favor a monoculture. And finally, it was confirmed the need for policies that favor access to productive resources for women to increase agrobiodiversity. Thank you, and I wait for your questions and comments.
Thank you all very much for the exciting abstracts that we could listen to already. And now I would like to introduce the next three speakers in our session, which will be Rachel Chase from University of Greenwich in Great Britain. And she will talk about fighting famine with the Tree Against Hunger, the impact of climate on the production of NSAID in Southwest Ethiopia. Then we will hear a talk from Sarah Jones from Biodiversity Alliance and CDR, talking about diversifying farms and landscapes, supports biodiversity conservation, food production, and farmer livelihoods. And third, the final talk in our abstract presenter session will be from Stephanie Korswagen from Wageningen University in the Netherlands. She will talk about climate change impacts on habitat suitability of cacao pests and diseases in Peru. Looking forward to these presentations.
Hello, I'm Rachel Chase, Associate Scientist at the Alliance of Biodiversity SIA in France, and a part-time PhD student at the University of Greenwich and Kew Gardens in the UK. And today I'll be talking about one of my PhD chapters, focusing on the impact of climate on insect production in Southwest Ethiopia. Insect is a perennial staple crop cultivated almost exclusively in the densely populated Ethiopian highlands, where it provides food security to more than 20 million people. The so-called Tree Against Hunger is known for its high yields, long shelf-life food products, and putative drought tolerance. Most Ethiopian smallholder farms are rainfall dependent with low levels of input and technology, and thus are vulnerable to climate change, characterized by severe droughts. For this study, I focused on the relationship between climate and insect production to determine if drought leads farmers to plant more insect to buffer seasonal food insecurity and ward off famine. The study area is the 30 insect growing zones, where varying topography and climate has led to high crop diversity, and hundreds of genetically diverse insect varieties have evolved despite the fact that they reproduce clonally. The complex climate of the highlands raises questions on how it has affected the distribution of this important food security crop. To investigate this, we use crop production data and gridded climate data in a linear mixed effects model to understand the relationship between climate and insect production, explore if periodic droughts cause farmers to plant more insect, and establish whether insects' climatic response is unique in the local agrisystem. A common drought indicator is the standardized precipitation evapotranspiration index, or SPEI, which is plotted here for the 30 zones over 3 decades, showing generally drier conditions in the first 2 decades in red, and wetter conditions in blue in the last decade. When we overlay the insect production data, there's a general increase in production during and after drought periods, when there's more focus on planting insect, and a decrease in wetter periods when crops such as cereals are more favored. Although our insect data is not complete, we can see increases after drought events in the year 2000, 2005, 2012, 2016. To test this apparent association, we created predictive variables, including bioclimatic variables and the SPEI index for each of the 30 zones. And then each of these variables were lagged by 1, 2, and 3 years to detect longer-term effects. Results of our regression show that insect production is predicted by both temperature and precipitation changes, and significantly correlated with SPEI drought index near -2. Since a negative SPEI indicates dry conditions, this means that insect production area increases around 2 years after a drought event. Then we asked, is this response unique to insect? What's happening with the other crops in the agrisystem? So we ran a regression model on the major crop groups, this time comparing short-term SPEI index with long-term SPEI index. Most of the crop groups are best predicted by short-term SPEI, and only the root crops such as yam and taro show the same longer-term response to drought as insect. And this is consistent with their role as drought-resistant food security crops, according to the literature. In conclusion, we detected a significant correlation between longer-term drought and insect production area, suggesting that farmers are planting more insect to buffer the effects of drought. And this relationship to drought is different from other agrisystem crops, which are impacted by more immediate changes in climate, except for the root crops. This study, and other chapters of my PhD, aim to increase the awareness of insect as an indigenous climate-resilient crop in an increasingly warmer and more variable environment. My work is supported by the University of Greenwich Natural Resource Institute, Banzi Grant, the Alliance of Biodiversity in SEAT, Royal Botanic Gardens at Kew, and Hawassa University in Ethiopia. Thank you for listening. Hi everyone, and thank you for joining. My name is Sarah Jones. I'm an associate scientist at the Alliance for Biodiversity and SEAT. I lead a waterland and ecosystems funded sustainable foods project, which I'll be talking about today. We work in collaboration with SDSN and CIRAD to compile and analyze the world's largest database documenting the effects of diversified farming on biodiversity, together with trade-offs for yield and farm profitability. So why this focus? Many of you will be aware that biodiversity is declining at alarming rates, and agriculture is named as one of the major drivers of biodiversity loss, rightly so. At the same time, many farmers have vulnerable livelihoods, so food production needs to shift to be more multifunctional and provide better outcomes for nature and for people. Many papers now show agroecological practices, particularly increasing diversity on farm and at landscape levels, is beneficial for biodiversity and other ecosystem services, or rather associated ecosystem services. What we wanted to know is whether yields are still viable as we move from simplified to diversified farming systems. So to answer that question, we have been conducting a series of meta-analyses looking at diversified farming effects on biodiversity and trade-offs with yield. Meta-analysis is a statistical approach to combining quantitative data from hundreds of field experiments that compare responses in similar sets of control and treatment sites. So in this case, we're interested in experiments that looked at biodiversity and or yield responses in simplified and diversified farming systems. We We separate studies that look at responses to changes in local diversity, meaning on-farm practices like intercropping and agroforestry or cover cropping, from studies that looked at responses to changes in landscape diversity. And here we mean changes to things like proportion of natural habitat or the edge density or landscape level crop diversity. And the idea with this is to help farmers and policymakers make decisions about which diversification strategies are best suited to which cropping systems and places to benefit biodiversity while minimizing trade-offs with yield. So first results. From our local database, that's farm level diversification practices, we found 774 experiments that measured changes in both biodiversity and yields in diversified and simplified farming systems. And we actually found there's no change in yields, so yields are comparable, while biodiversity increases, but differences are not significant. Win-win outcomes, so where biodiversity and yield both benefit from diversification, were found in 25% of cases, whereas in 32% we found a trade-off where biodiversity benefits but yields decline. However, importantly, there were significant differences in the probability of a synergy or a trade-off across biomes, cropping systems, and diversification practices. So for example, here we are looking at the change in probability of each of the 4 outcomes, so win-win, win-lose, lose-win, or lose-lose, for biodiversity and yields across biomes and across cropping systems. We see, so you can see that when biodiversity is benefiting, the bar is green, and when it's dark green, it means yield is also benefiting. So we can see that biodiversity is predicted to benefit more than 50% of the time in most biomes, but not in tropical or boreal forests. So this might reflect that on-farm diversification is less effective for boosting biodiversity in these forested zones for the diversification practices represented in our study. And we also see that a win-win for biodiversity and yields is the most likely outcome for Mediterranean, temperate, and desert regions, whereas trade-offs where yield losses are incurred are more common in tropical and montane grasslands. So this indicates that policy interventions may be needed in those regions to help farmers diversify and manage trade-offs with yield. And similarly, across cropping systems, we can see that there are more likely to be trade-offs when the crop is cotton, or it's a pasture system, or it's a fruit and nut system. So policy interventions might again be necessary there to help farmers manage the trade-off that's expected with yield. Shifting to the landscape level, so this is diversification where we're increasing landscape complexity. We found 1,132 experiments documenting biodiversity responses in complex and simplified landscapes. And we found that biodiversity levels for nearly all taxa are significantly higher in complex landscapes, irrespective of the way that the landscape is diversified, meaning that whether it's more complex because there's a higher proportion of natural habitat, or it has a higher edge density, or there's more plant species diversity. However, we also found that there were a lack of experiments documenting changes in biodiversity in some contexts. So particularly in Africa and Asia, there were far fewer experiments than in North America and in Europe. And there was also a tendency for short-term studies where the responses are surveyed over only a few months or a year compared to several years. And this is important because we saw that the benefits of biodiversity tend to increase with time. So in conclusion, we have been able to collate data from thousands of field experiments, and we think it's actually the world's biggest data bank of biodiversity effects. So more can always be added, so we are expecting to continue to add to these databases. Local and landscape farmland diversification often benefits biodiversity. However, yields sometimes, but not always, increase. So where yields are lower, it seems that social technological innovations and policy support are likely to be needed to fill the gap and allow farmers to diversify and not incur losses. Large gaps in evidence need to be filled still by the CGIAR or by others through new field experiments and additional efforts to synthesize results from existing literature. So in particular, there is a need to understand better how to diversify effectively in non-cereal cropping systems, the impacts of certain practices, such as embedding natural habitat, are not as well studied as others. And there's also a need for more long-term studies. That's all I've got time for. Happy to hear from you if you'd like to get in touch with any questions. Bye for now.
Hello, my name is Stephanie Korswagen, and I will present to you the climate change impacts on the most important pests and diseases that affect cacao production in Peru. Our first question was to identify the current habitat of these most important pests and diseases, and second, to identify how climate change would impact on the habitat suitability. Third, to identify which are the most important climate or soil variables that are driving these changes. And finally, to see how these habitat changes would impact on cacao production practices in the future. This is especially relevant because cacao is produced by smallholder farmers that depend on their production for their livelihoods. Currently, the habitat for cacao and where it is cultivated is located along the eastern slope of the Andes and towards the lower Amazon. We conducted the ensemble suitability modeling with one scenario for current conditions and 3 climate change scenarios up to 2070 of these diverse pests and diseases in Peru to understand how the habitat would change in spatial distribution, but also in the intensity of potential attacks. Our first step was to prioritize the pests and diseases that are most important, which we did together with relevant experts. For the ensemble modeling, we used a wide range of predictor layers and as well as a wide range of fungi, insects, nematodes, and weeds with, of course, available data for our study area. Since this is an ongoing research, the next steps consist on incorporating variables for soil humidity and relative humidity, which are known to be very important in the distribution of nematodes as well as fungi and weed. Some of the results we have, as you can see here, are 4 of the main species, 3 fungi causing diseases and 1 bug, typical pest. And we see that these species coincide largely with the range where cacao is usually cultivated. In these 4 species actually are the ones causing most losses in crop production, not only in Peru, but also in neighboring countries. If we take a closer look at the ecological niche of 2 species, we see that the distribution points in red show that they are present in warmer as well as hotter climates. This means that cold temperatures as well as dry areas limit the distribution of the species. Here we have some examples of, 1 fungi, 1 nematode, 1 weed, and 1 insect for models towards 2070. In green, we show the areas that will remain suitable for this diverse species in the future, and we see that the range varies largely. In red, we see the areas that would lose suitability for each species, and here we see a common trend. The areas towards the central part of Peru and towards the lower Amazon basin are going to lose suitability for this species. These areas will become hotter as well as drier in the future. On contrast, areas that would gain suitability for some species, as you can see in the map for the nematodes, shown in blue, are located towards higher elevation in the Andes, but also towards the northern part of Peru. These areas are projected to become more humid in the future. Now, an important message here is that areas that lose suitability do not indicate that the species will not be present in the future on cacao crops. It actually just indicates that management would be easier. In contrast, the areas that would gain suitability for certain pests and diseases will have to focus on implementing more control practices for these species. We believe that our work gives valuable insights to understand these changes in areas where these pests and diseases could expand their range or become more severe, or on the contrary, to be easier to manage. This is the basis to address adaptation and risk reduction strategies tailor-made for each location. In addition to our knowledge, this is the first study that compiles multiple pests and diseases in one single modeling exercise. Therefore, we add to understanding a more holistic perspective on integrated pest management. I'd like to finish with two other messages. High temperatures, as well as high humidity or flooded soils, they do not only increase the attack of pests and diseases, but they also turn the cacao trees more susceptible. And second, cacao management practices will have to focus on adapting to the impacts of climate change, perhaps increased drought risk or flood risk, but at the same time implement best practices on the farm to maintain healthy conditions and to control the presence and the attack of pests and diseases. With this, I thank you very much for your attention.
Many thanks to all the speakers in this session. And yeah, I think with your short presentations, you made it very clear that we need to take bold and urgent action to enhance the delivery of ecosystem services and climate resilience in food production systems. And farming that relies on biodiversity and occupies more than almost half of the global landmass holds enormous potential, of course, to be solution space for this great sustainability challenge that you were talking about. And now I would like to address a couple of questions from the audience to you. And we'll address some of them targetedly to individual speakers and some of them to the whole group, so you're free to answer them. My first question goes to our first speaker from today, to Viviana. And Viviana, we received a question for you. What about interactions between climate and other biotic factors that may be decoupled from climate?
Yeah, thank you for the question. So, of course, in our study, we focus on the abiotic stress that will be brought by climate change. But there are also an increase in biotic stresses, such as increase in incidence of pests and diseases on cacao cultivation under climate change. And actually, although in this study we identified climate change tolerant genotypes just for abiotic stresses, a next step in the research will be also to test whether these genotypes are also in addition tolerant, for instance, to higher pests and diseases for future climate change. So that will be definitely a next step for the research.
Thank you very much for this interesting answer and perspective. And then the next question would go to David. Here we got the question, you found that farms managed by women have significantly more agrobiodiversity. So why is that, was the question.
Well, hello everyone, thanks for the question. And women have higher levels of agrobiodiversity because they historically save local seeds to feed their household. Additionally, due to cultural factors, men look for ways to provide monetary resources to their households, and the way to do it is through monocultures and cash crops. That's one reason.
Thank you. Then a next question we received would also be about a correlation. It would be addressed to Sarah. Sarah, you mentioned that diversity and yields correlate negatively in pasture systems, and that sounds a bit surprising to members in our audience. So what could be the reasons from your perspective?
Yeah, thanks for the question. I was just having a quick check of my database to try and give an intelligent answer. And I can see that a lot of the data points in the pasture systems come from the tropics and tropical grassland systems. So first of all, there's not a very good representation. It's globally, I mean, it's from one particular biome. So there's just a caveat. But also the diversification practices that are represented in pasture systems are all embedding natural habitat. So things like increasing hedgerows, providing flower strips around the edges, things like that, which we have found tends to decrease yields while being actually the mechanism that has the most benefits for biodiversity. So yeah, I think that can explain to some extent those results.
Thank you very much. And at this point also, we know that one of our speakers, Nancy, is currently in Peru, and for her it would be like 4 a.m. or so, but Stephanie volunteered to answer a question to her, and I was really interested to hear. She emphasizes the importance to include traditional systems with domestic native crops in Peru, and that policy will be of key importance here. So how can this be achieved from your perspective?
Well, I am not familiar so much with our case study, but in Peru, like politics have a very important role in promoting the use of agrobiodiversity products and really using it. So the Ministry of Agriculture is behind that. The problem is that sometimes if you manage something at the central level, like national level, that has to actually be managed on farm. So it has to come really to local incentives too. So then it's very difficult to translate what can have been agreed at national level and to put it really on local. You need resources, you need financing, you need capacity building and technological resources, perhaps irrigation or other help. So these are some barriers that can be then blocking, even though there is this agreed importance that we need to conserve biodiversity and use it, there might be some barriers in the process.
Thank you very much. And how does this relate to your particular study? So I would, from transitioning from the question that was addressed to Nancy, I would transition to a question also to you briefly. How would this relate to the work that you just presented?
Well, my work is more related to what Viviana presented because she was working on cacao genotypes. And then, as she mentioned, the next step was to analyze cacao together with the pests and diseases. And afterwards, we might come to cacao pests and diseases and natural controllers. But policies also have an important role in, for instance, if you promote the use of agrochemicals, then you really do not pay the necessary attention that diversity should receive. Not only different cacao varieties, but also the natural controllers or promote ecological or organic farming practices. Mm-hmm. So then to go to your question, the role of policies would preferably go into resilient farming practices or carbon neutral certifications perhaps, but of course also organic farming, fair trade, and all of this that really goes to manage good conditions on farm. If you promote that, like these best practices, then you are helping the system as a whole. And this is not only for cacao, but for other crops.
Thank you very much. And then Rachel, you showed us a great example of trees used to enhance climate resilience. And we got the question, what other tree species are potentially useful for Ethiopian farmers and what limits diverse tree use?
Okay, thanks for the question. I think it was from Chris. Well, first of all, I just need to say that it's a misconception that insect is a tree. So it's a giant herb, just like banana. It's actually very closely related to banana. But in terms of other tree species in the Ethiopian highlands, coffee, as you probably know, is native to Ethiopia, a very important cash crop for smallholder farmers. And also fruit trees such as lemons and mangoes, avocados, papaya are part of the very diverse garden. Eucalyptus is also very important, but more for building material, fire, windbreaks, and those kind of uses, not necessarily for food. I think that the diversity of trees might be limited a lot by the population and the land use restraints in Ethiopia, because you have such a dense population that all the land is being used, and a lot of the semi-natural areas are being turned into gardens. So there's that limitation, but also the climate is a really important limitation to diversity, because there are extended drought periods, as we all know, of the famous famine in Ethiopia, and lack of irrigation. So farmers don't have access to irrigation that they might need to produce some of the tree crops that we know and love. Thanks.
Thank you so much for this perspective. And I would like to thank all the speakers. Time flies with these exciting discussions that we have here. We will take some of the other audience questions that we couldn't answer now into the policy forum later, and we will make sure to respond to them also in the chat. Thank you all very much for your contributions, for your commitment, and those inspiring presentations. I now look forward to the panel discussion and to pick up those topics as well in the panel discussion. Thank you all very much, and also to the audience and inspiring rest of the Congress today. See you later.
Cool.
Welcome back, everyone. I'm very excited to introduce our panelists now for the panel discussion. We will have Jonathan Davies from IUCN, Senior Agriculture Advisor at IUCN and Coordinator of the Global Drylands Initiative. Then we have Dennis Garrity from the Evergreening Alliance. He's a former director of the World Agroforestry Center and now chairman to the Global Evergreening Alliance. And his career is focused on improving small-scale farming systems in the tropics. Then we will have Romina Kavatasi from IFAD. She's lead economist and at the International Fund for Agricultural Development. And she's lead author of several recent reports on sustainable rural development. And then we have Camilla Moonen, assistant professor at the Sant'Anna University in Pisa, Italy. And there she leads and co-leads the agroecology research group and many related research projects focused on sustainable and biodiversity-friendly farming at a landscape scale. So such a well-suited, distinguished panelist set that we have here. I'm super excited to be able to talk to you in front of our audience here. And I prepared a couple of questions for you, and we have a couple of questions resulting from the previous talk. And I would like to address my first question to Jonathan Davies and Romina when she's here. If not, maybe she could be replaced. First, I simply would like to ask you, what do you associate with the presentations that you just heard, and how do the topics relate to the goals of your own work? Jonathan and Romina, please.
Okay, well, thank you, Bea. And since Romina's not here, I can jump in and go first. Interesting cross-section of presentations. Really sheds a light, I think, on one of the challenges we have when we work on agrobiodiversity is the very diversity of it, and being clear, you know, which aspects we're focusing on. It's something that we've been engaging with increasingly and quite rapidly in IUCN, in order to make sure that we really take full advantage of the opportunities around agrobiodiversity, but by taking a sufficiently broad understanding, actually a broad understanding of biodiversity overall. Biodiversity is the genes, the species, and the ecosystems, importantly, and often forgotten, the ecosystems. Agriculture depends on nature for fertile soil, for clean water, for pollination, pest control. We heard about some of those ecosystem services in the presentation, and there's other services as well. When agriculture is being practiced sustainably, it can rehabilitate not only these services that support agriculture, support itself, but other ecosystem services that benefit society. In fact, to be sustainable, if you look at the broad definitions of sustainable agriculture, it has to contribute to conserving biodiversity and preserving natural capital that's necessary for resilient and productive soils on farms and in landscapes. So it's providing services to farmers, but also beyond the farm. I think it's important to understand that. This is central to what we're trying to work on, get a more complete understanding of that, to see where some of the opportunities and incentives can be developed around these, particularly these off-farm services. These, you know, in the nature-based solutions language, we talk about societal benefits. We're coming at this currently by focusing on land health as a kind of a broad concept, which is reflected in the richness of soil biodiversity. And that soil biodiversity determines how ecosystems function to a large extent, how they store and supply water, how they store carbon, their overall fertility, pest control, and a number of other services to farmers. One of the challenges is that we tend to zoom in, or some actors, I'd say, let's say, and some tools zoom in to one or other of these elements, and then sometimes lose sight of the bigger picture. And this has consequences, because we particularly miss some of these opportunities for incentives, like for carbon storage or protecting water supplies, or incentives related to reducing risks of drought or flood. There are good examples of this going on. Some countries are doing this, but in a piecemeal way, and generally it's a missed opportunity, particularly when it comes to innovative financing solutions for large-scale action, large-scale adoption. And then maybe one other consequence of that is that by focusing too narrowly on agrobiodiversity, we actually could miss a really transformational step. I really think land health could be the doorway to sustainability in a lot of other areas. through sustainable farming practices, we can take steps towards addressing then some of the more intractable issues, the more controversial issues around agriculture and environment. For example, farmers that are taking greater care of their soil are less likely to over-apply chemicals, less likely to contribute to pollution because they're trying to maintain life in the soil. So, overall, I think this is a great entry point to reduce the environmental footprint of agriculture.
Thank you. I would fully agree, and I would like to hand over to Camilla and to ask you to explain briefly, maybe with an example, why farm diversity simply and climate resilience are important for food production from your work perspective.
Well, hi, good morning, Bea, and hi to everyone around the globe and around this round table. So, well, in order to understand the importance of diversity for climate change resilient agriculture, we need to realize that the global food production system is still greatly depending on local abiotic and weather conditions. And in the industrialized agricultural systems, the role of local biotic conditions, so biodiversity, for food production, they have been largely suppressed. But luckily, in the agroecological farming systems, also the local biodiversity plays a key role in the food production. And this is fundamental for the capacity of the system to respond to climate change. So the key problem with climate change is, of course, that the predictability of local weather conditions becomes more and more difficult. And therefore, what we need is to design cropping and farming systems that are diversified in order to make sure that in any situation, the overall farming community is able to produce food and other products. And so what I think is that at the moment, we have the scientific evidence proving that biodiversity is in fact the only tool we have to respond to this unpredictability in patterns in climate. And I think this has been very well defined by the so-called insurance hypothesis. This hypothesis states that in diverse communities, there are more possibilities to find traits that are adapted to sudden changes. And so we cannot know in advance which traits will actually be useful, but in the diverse communities, we may have these necessary traits present, and then we, as agroecologists and farmers and researchers, can support these traits and amplify them. So the same is true, in fact, for diverse farming systems and diversified farms. So if a farm hosts different cropping systems and different crops and different crop varieties, then in case of climate change, the overall all the farms in the region will continue to still produce food. And so the more diverse and complex the local farming systems are, the more stable will be the local food system when it needs to respond to a change. And what I want to add is that, of course, now we focus quite on climate change, but this is not the only example. There may also be, for example, political changes that, so changes in policies that can affect heavily local food systems. And an example is what is happening now in Europe, where huge farms with quite simple crop systems, producing mainly wheat or some summer crops like maize, are very heavily reliant on herbicides such as glyphosate. And these systems panic as soon as policymakers start to talk about a ban on glyphosate or herbicides, specific herbicides. So if these systems would be more diversified, only part of their farm activities would be affected by these changing agricultural and environmental policies. And so it would be more easy for them also to adapt to that kind of changes.
Yeah.
But again, of course, if these systems would be more diversified, they would also be less reliant on the use of these herbicides. So therefore, to conclude, I think that agricultural policy should really focus on supporting this wide diversity of farming systems. And they should not only look at diversity in traits of the crops, the animals, the associated biodiversity, but also at the diversity in like the farmer traits. So with this, I mean, looking at different farming philosophies, different, there are also the ethics of farmers, passions of farmers, their socioeconomic traits, their socioeconomic conditions. And I would really hope that policies should support this diversity to support obtaining these very diversified farming systems.
Yeah. Thank you very much. Dennis, related to that response and to this discussion, from your perspective, what are the main enablers that help farmers to enhance diversity on their farms? And also second, what can researchers do to remove potential barriers?
Well, I think some of the main enablers really build on what Camilla was saying. And that is that as it's an ingrained, intuitive principle of small-scale farmers to diversify their enterprises in the face of all the uncertainties in the market and now particularly in the climate. And so there's going to be a real trend towards greater farm diversity, in my view, simply because it is so intuitively obvious to farmers that they must try to diversify in order to deal with the uncertainties that they're dealing with. At a larger global scale, what I think is really interesting is that there's a grand transformation underway related to what we're talking about here. It's toward more agroecological and agroforestry systems. And this transition is going to be enhanced by three major factors, three drivers. One is that global population is actually leveling off, and probably it will soon peak by mid-century and begin to decline. And this is a huge historic change, huge, because it's going to open up windows of opportunity for more agroecological production systems. A second change is that food consumption habits are changing, and they will drive a greater interest in more nutritious and healthy foods, lower meat consumption, and that itself is going to drive the markets toward more diversity in fruits and nuts and other nutritious products beyond the basic food calories of meat and grains, food grains. And finally, of course, climate change is going to impact everything, and it's going to mean that farming must adapt itself to these systems. So these three drivers, in my view, open up a huge window of opportunity for transition to a new agriculture where production is based on agroecological principles. It's our great opportunity to do what we've been working to do for 50 years because of these drivers. And I see them as really critical to the future, and we should take confidence that there's great opportunity to do so.
Thank you so much, Dennis. Romina, we also know that you are the lead author of several recent reports on sustainable rural development, and I would love to hear from you, from your perspective, what are the major challenges of combining food production and diversities, particularly in developing countries, and where are the key opportunities?
Thank you, Bea. Yes, we just released in September the Rural Development Report, which is the IFAD flagship publication, and it was on food system transformation for rural prosperity. So, of course, our main focus is related to rural small-scale producers who produce most of the food we eat, most of the calories we eat, and we should not forget that most of these calories are also coming from mainly three crops. So the topics that is being discussed at this Congress are of high relevance to the key findings and recommendations of the report. So in terms of the challenges and opportunities, first, I think the market is a challenge, and it can also be an opportunity. And that is both for input and output markets, because and focusing on small-scale producers, it's the challenge is to make sure that they have access to diversity of seeds, because our main recommendation is to diversify production, to diversify crops and varieties, and to diversify towards a more nutritious diet, so switch from calories towards quality and diversification, it's also important that they have access to the seeds for that production, but also to the output market. So there must be an alignment with policies related to output markets. So once they grow those crops and those varieties, they need to be able to harvest the benefits also in terms of gross margin and income. Another key opportunity is also related to nudging consumers' choices, the demand side, making important, again, market intervention in terms of ruling the possibility to accessing and diversifying what they buy, and also making them more aware of the possibility and potential of diets and of the nutrition that can be brought about. Another key challenge and opportunity is tapping on the midstream. A lot can be done to increase the whole process that go from after the farm to the consumption side, so transformation processes, distribution and consumption. And of course, that also goes with that storage facilities and cooling facilities, which in some cases are the key determinants to avoid food loss and waste. And finally, of course, it's important to raise consciousness, awareness, and educate the whole world about the importance of various crops and varieties, and not just focus on those 3 crops where most of our calories are coming from. I'm thinking about neglected and underutilized species, but there are many, many crops and varieties that we can use, and they shouldn't be just focusing on the niche market, but they should become more accessible and known to the rest of the world. So overall, investing on the whole chain, investing on demand side, and making farmers available making the farmers access to the market for both input and output. Thank you.
Thank you, that's great. Before we move on with some questions that are directed to some of you, I would like to ask all of you for a brief statement, so really for like a fast question answer session. Maybe you can think of one example and pick like one example that you want to highlight for the question. I would like to ask you to give us a few glimpses into the most promising developments in the future that you see in your field, and how do we make the shift to diversified farms, and what does the future of food production look like in your opinion? Anyone who wants to start, maybe with a short example, and then we still want to save some time for the upcoming questions. What is your opinion? What is a key future development or movement that we need to make? Jonathan, please.
Well, I mean, you know, you put us on the spot with a massive question and 1 minute to respond, so I might as well jump in quickly and then other people can think. You have to, I mean, it is a vast question. There are so many points, but I'd say maybe just one thing that I found quite inspiring, just a recent experience, relates to what I was saying earlier about the value of ecosystem services and how they're underestimated. I was talking to a New Zealand farmer who was practicing regenerative agriculture. He'd adopted it on quite a large scale, no incentives, no external incentives, let's say. He was selling his product in mainstream markets, so no special markets. And so I asked him why he was doing it, and he said, well, it was obvious. His farming practices were drying out the soil, and he was being exposed to drought losses on his crops in normal years. And so he had spontaneously adopted regenerative farming practices because he knew when you increase the organic matter in the soil, they're less dry, they become more moist. That's just one example, but actually I've come across that in a lot of it. I live in Africa, and a lot of farmers, that's the incentive for them too. So this has a strong link with climate change. I saw a question in there, and one of the things that came out of COP26 was much more respect for nature and addressing biodiversity and climate change together. And I think some of these ecosystem services, you know, they're complex, which is why we ignore them and we don't deal with them very well, but they provide massive opportunities. And when you talk to farmers, they get it because they're living on the ground. They see it in their farming practices. So I think connect with what they're learning, and then we'll find incentives for scaling up.
Thank you. Dennis.
Yeah, building on what Jonathan has just said about regenerative agriculture practices, one particular type of those practices that I think is going to gain a lot more traction in the future is what we call evergreen agriculture, the integration of trees into cropping systems. And this is particularly being adopted by millions of small farmers in the tropics. In Africa, there's been an enormous renaissance of integration of trees into cropping systems, particularly in the semi-arid areas where drought is such a problem. And we see this as picking up and getting a lot more attention in the future, although it goes against the grain of all of prior agricultural research and experience. And so we have a real uphill battle to actually make the case that farmers are doing something that really makes sense. So evergreen agriculture, I think, is going to be one of our big promising examples for the coming years.
That's great. Thank you. Thank you, Dennis and Jonathan. Any further thoughts to add? Also, Romina, we got another question in that I think is well related to that one. Also, what is the role of women in future agriculture when they prepare majority of the food in many households worldwide? So do you have a particular perspective on this from the findings of your reports?
Yes, and I think I'd like to add to that also that I think it's important that various aspects are now being integrated in the whole picture of trying to switch towards a more diversified production, and agriculture and climate change is one key thing. And I think the Food System Summit, followed by the COP26, in a moment in which climate is becoming more and more a topic that is evident, we need to address, we must address, and with that, adaptation is the most important part. Of course, in saying this, women do play a key role in what they grow, in the selection of what they grow and what they prepare, in the nutrition aspects they play within the household and the family, and in making them more empowered, giving them more agency to make decisions and to be part of the overall management of what is grown, what is eaten in the family, and making them more endowed with access to resources and to also financial resources to play a key role for both farms and also for all the processing that can go after the farm is one key finding. And of course, when things are better integrated in the whole, let's say, value chain, things work better. So tapping up on what Dennis mentioned on the growing trees and crops, we have a number of examples where that worked very well, and particularly it works very well when you add to the growing also the transformation and the selling part. So when interventions are comprehensive, they tend to work much better.
Thank you. Camilla, on how comprehensive the measures are, maybe you would like to add a statement. We also got the question related to your further previous answer, that you mentioned really good points, but our listeners would be interested, what types of policies do you think would be effective in helping farmers? Maybe you can intertwine those with your perspective on future farming. That would be great. Thank you.
Okay, thanks. Yeah, as also Jonathan said, it's a really big question for 1 minute. So I'll try to be brief. So first of all, when you asked this question to me, I was thinking about what Karl Popper once said, that we cannot predict the future course of human history. And I think that's also true for our food systems, because we cannot even predict how our own generation uses the knowledge that we actually have at hand. And we have a lot of knowledge and a lot of possibilities to help us to produce sustainable food systems. And the big question is whether we will be able to make intelligent and responsible use of this knowledge. And if I look around this conference today and the other days, then I think the future looks really bright. But the question remains if a few cunning and powerful people will continue to manipulate the economic situation to their own advantage. So that I think that puts the future of our sustainable and biodiverse food systems, the answer is there, and that's very hard to predict. So when we talk about diverse systems, I think the key problem is that diversification means that we need incredibly more knowledge. So the systems become so much more knowledge intensive. And it means that we have more stability over the long run, but we have less control and less predictability of the system. And I think that is the main barrier for farmers to pick up on more diverse farming systems. So what we need is solutions that support the management of more complex systems. Management to make choices, what to grow, how to grow, where to grow. And I think that ICT solutions and big data can really provide some help in analyzing complex systems and maybe providing some predictions of what could work in certain situations. And it makes it even more complex because agroecological solutions are locally, have to be locally designed and can only work if they were designed locally. And that means that each local system needs their own solutions and their own systems. So what I really think is that we need policies that connect these ICTs and big data approaches to usable tools for farmers. And this means that the farming community needs to be involved in this, and it needs to be co-designed together with them. And I really like the tool for cacao that was presented by Viviana Ceccarelli, because that's an effort to make a simple tool that can be used by farmers. And just to give a very quick reply about what could be the role of women, I think that normally women are seen as the people that are more able to manage complex systems and to do multitasking. And in complex farming systems, I think the role of women can be huge for that reason.
Thank you very much, Camilla. That's a good point, very good point to end that statement, because yeah, I agree. I also find findings very intriguing, very interesting, that find about different social roles in the farming, also the global representation of perspectives, and their importance for us to improve in the combination of food production improvement, biodiversity conservation, climate mitigation. In a nutshell, we often see that some perspectives are underrepresented or appear to be underrepresented, and we may need to really increase our efforts to include them in order to make meaningful contribution, meaningful improvement of food production systems. So with this perspective, I would like to throw it back to you all again, this question. We got the question, how can we protect or conserve indigenous people crops? And then we got one targeted question to Jonathan. How do you see the challenges, but also the opportunities of combining food production, biodiversity conservation, and climate mitigation? So I would like to start with you, Jonathan.
Right, okay. I mean, this echoes a bit what I said, and I do think that there's growing recognition. In fact, if one of the major, let's say, statements that came out of the World Conservation Congress in Marseille this year in September was that it's not an option. We have to address the climate crisis and the biodiversity crisis together. There's no doubt about that. And nowhere is that truer than with agriculture. And actually, the opportunities are tremendous. We okay, I'm not going to try and quote figures and data, but there's plenty of evidence that shows that there are real win-wins here. There's a lot of skepticism. There is a tendency to try and discredit the most sustainable farming practices by, again, neglecting some of their values. And I think that's one of the biggest risks we face now. There are detractors. There are people invested in the status quo. But I think I'm quite inspired by the number of governments that are taking it seriously, the policies that are being developed, the number of farmers that are adopting spontaneously or large numbers through big projects in different parts of the world. I'm actually quite inspired. I think right now that it's a really critical moment where there's an energy and a momentum that's never been there before. And it's because people are so much more aware through the discussions on climate change of our dependence on nature. And that's opening the doors for us to really start scaling up. We know what to do. We know what the practices are because they've been tested for many years. Now the innovation is needed in really going to scale.
Thank you. One of you, I will just open the floor to you all because we have about 2 minutes left for a final statement. And maybe one of you has something left that he or she wants to say. Romina?
Yeah, just wanted to say that one crucial thing with climate change is related to adaptation. So most of the investments go on mitigation, but what is mostly needed, especially for agriculture and for rural small-scale producers, is adaptation. And the indigenous people have some ingenious way of adapting to climate. So if anything, we have a lot to learn from them. And certainly in terms of protecting the crops, there are various mechanisms, including, for example, payment for environmental services, where it's relevant. It's important to also compensate and make sure that we protect those systems and those crops and varieties. And I just want to finalize saying that this connection between climate and agriculture and biodiversity is essential for us to move ahead. We need to approach things in a very holistic and comprehensive way. Thank you.
Thank you very much. Dennis, maybe you have also a final statement that you want to make.
Yeah, just very briefly, I'd like to just reinforce what Jonathan is saying. He mentioned that it's a critical moment right now where after so many decades in which agroecological, biodiversity, rich agriculture has been on the defensive, it's now on the attack. And I believe that the climate crisis is actually driving that. The fact that we are going to open up new opportunities through dietary changes and more concern about nutrition is going to open that up as well. People's concern about the environment in general. There are many positive factors that are creating a new era for agroecological agriculture to move ahead and for us to transform the way we produce food in a way that is not predicted. Camilla said, you can't predict the future, but we can project the fact that these drivers are moving us all in the same direction, the crisis drivers as well as the opportunity drivers. And that is a great thing for us to grab and move forward.
Thank you so much, Dennis, Camilla, Jonathan, Romina. Thank you all very much for the session. I'm about to close this session now, but it's the Congress will continue. Before we continue, really a huge thanks to all the amazing contributions today in the session. A huge thanks to all the international speakers, our panelists here. Thanks for sharing your insights and findings on what it means to combine diversity on farms and food production in all these different systems and settings that we discussed. I would like to conclude with a statement linked to our introduction of this today's session, that knowing should not be the end and cannot be the end. The presentations and discussions of the session have shown very clearly that we need to increase efforts regarding the implementation of sustainable agricultural practices. And in order to support human well-being in the future, we need to address the twin challenge of global biodiversity decline and climate change coupled with human population growth. There are a couple of approaches how we can do this. And with this concluding statement and perspective on agricultural systems in the future, I would like to highlight our upcoming session on indigenous people, neglected and underutilized species, foods of tomorrow. I also would like to highlight that all the questions that we couldn't answer here or that we would like to take a deeper look at will be taken into the Policy and Business Forum starting today at 2 p.m. Central European Time. And with this, thank you all very much again, and I look forward to these sessions and seeing you again in the conclusion and closure of the day at 5 p.m. where I will be back. Thank you all and goodbye.